lecture for History 3326, Modern African History. So, this brief video lecture is going to be talking about indigenous African slave systems. That's the topic for the week, and essentially our biggest concern is looking at what slavery looks like on the African continent, mostly before the onset of the transatlantic slave trade. Obviously, this issue of the Atlantic slave trade is going to be one that dominates African history for about 400 years. It's a major episode in the history of West Africa and the Atlantic world. And ultimately, what we want to do this week is, before we get to those big global slave trades, we want to take a look at what's existing there in Africa prior to the onset and intensification of these more global trades. And with that said, there are a lot of different types of slavery or human servitude in Africa. The reason I make that distinction is because a lot of what we look at from the West, and you're looking from the outside in, it's a system of human bondage in one form or another. It might be something that we would consider to be closer to serfdom, closer to indentured servitude, or some other European system. It's a little bit closer to that than it is to our actual slavery. Because in the West, ever since Roman times, slavery has had a distinct property and legal relationship between the slave and slave master. In the Western world, slavery develops in as much as the human being who's taken as a slave becomes the actual legal property of the slave master. And that never spreads around sub-Saharan Africa. That's the type of slavery that will eventually bleed all throughout the Roman Empire. It will trickle down into early Christian kingdoms, and it will trickle into early Islamic kingdoms as well. So all of the Abrahamic traditions, whether it's coming from Christianity or Islam, are going to ultimately practice that sort of legal property-based definition of slavery that we saw in the Roman Empire. But where the Roman Empire never really gets, the interior of sub-Saharan Africa, there are numerous types of human bondage or servitude. And slavery really doesn't do justice. It doesn't describe all of these institutions collectively. It's simply the closest word that the West applies to these institutions that we see in Africa. Looking at what exists in Africa, there is one overarching theory that attempts to describe all African slave systems, and that is the slavery to kinship continuum theory. It was first thrown out there in 1979 by anthropologists Susan Myers and Igor Kopytov. Their argument overall is that slavery in Africa is too diverse to have one set definition, but there is one hallmark of every African slave institution, and that is represented in this continuum. When a person's first taken as a slave and moved to another community, they are socially marginalized. They have no friends, no family, no network to help support them when they show up in that new community. Secondly, the person who's being brought in as a slave generally has no understanding or knowledge of the language of the place in which they're going to be enslaved. But over time, they learn the cultural customs, they learn the language, they learn how the slave society works, and by the end of their terms of enslavement, they can eventually be rolled back into a kinship network or a family or lineage, which is the main organizational unit of most African societies. So at the end of the day, somebody who's taken as a slave in Africa, you have to understand that their understanding of slavery, or even being in the position of slave, does not at all relate to what we think of when we think of what we call chattel slavery, or the type of slavery that's being practiced in the Atlantic world, one that's based on that legal distinction of the slave being property. You see, in sub-Saharan Africa, the slave is a human being. They're treated as such, and it's their labor that is owned. It's access to their labor and productivity, not the human being themselves. They are not the property that's being bought and sold and traded. It is their labor that's being bought and sold and traded. And so that syncs up a little bit closer more to what we would call serfdom or indentured servitude in the West. But ultimately, being rolled into this kinship network would help so that you are not distinguishable from the freeborn members of society. Eventually, you will become very much a member of the society in which you're enslaved. You might marry a person. Maybe they're slave-born, maybe they're free-born. But at the end of the day, your children, yourself, your spouses, many generations down the line, you're ultimately going to become indistinguishable from a lot of the freeborn members of the community in a lot of circumstances. Under circumstances in certain areas, you might find that there's a long-term social stigma applied to being a slave, so that certain groups of people within a village in Africa might be deemed unmarriable or being outcast because of their slave origin. But what we're really hinting at, and where this theory comes from when Myers and Kopytov come up with it in 1979, is that historians and social scientists are extremely concerned in distinguishing Western slavery from African slavery. And at the end of the day, there is one major difference between these two, and that is the fact that African slavery is simply not based on race. And so that is something that it definitely needs to be addressed when you're looking at African slave systems. When you're looking at the West, being of African descent, almost across the board in the Americas is going to put you in some sort of condition of servitude. You might not be fully a slave. You might be a slave whose parents were able to manumit themselves, but you're living in this lower status because in the West at this time period, to be of African descent is to be slave-based. And so ultimately, there is a racial component to how slavery works in the Atlantic world. Obviously, on the African continent, where everyone is of African descent, that is not the organizational factor around which slavery is based. Now, because slavery is much more informal and oftentimes benign in West Africa and across sub-Saharan Africa, what we're often seeing is that there's really no mechanism in which violence or the threat of violence is used to compel your slaves to do anything. And so really when we look at the West, what is keeping people working on a plantation? Especially when we know that in a lot of circumstances they outnumber the freeborn community in any area of the Americas. Why are they sitting there working for these people? And the answer becomes violence or the threat of violence. The slave codes of the Americas are based on violence. If you don't do what I tell you to do, I am going to beat you. And if the beating is not enough to compel you, I'm going to kill you as an example for everybody else who might be thinking the same way you are. And so that's how the slave systems in the Western world and in the Americas work. That level of violence simply just does not exist in most sub-Saharan African slave systems. You're not using violence to compel people to do what you want them to do. You're using cultural norms and an understanding of the system in which these individuals are living to compel them what to do. You don't need to threaten to beat somebody or kill somebody to get them to do the work. But there's a great diversity of slavery on the African continent, or of, again, human bondage, or servitude. Human servitude is another thing we could call it. And there's three major types. Even though you can't really say this is how all slavery in Africa worked, we can break it down into three broad categories. You had human slavery, which is, in its physical manifestations, very much like what we'd recognize in the West. You have domestic slaves who are tasked with helping around the house, cleaning up, cooking dinner. You have agricultural slaves who are going to go out and help you harvest in the field. But these kinds of slave systems are in operation in small agrarian communities. So generally what you're seeing is there's not a great deal of distinction between what the slave does on a daily basis and what the freeborn person does. Everybody gets up and goes to work in the fields. It's just that a slave happens to be working for the benefit of my fields because I'm the slave master. And in a lot of circumstances, you can have slaves owning slaves. And so that's a reality in Africa as well, in which an individual could be working, their labor could benefit me, but underneath them, somebody else's labor benefits them, which indirectly also benefits me. It's kind of like the world's oldest pyramid scheme. But you just want as many people working underneath you as possible, and that's what makes you influential and successful economically. But that's what most human slaves are going to do, and there's a huge diversity of roles that human slaves can play. Sometimes they're going to become elite royal guards, as we saw in the kingdom of Dahomey. Those of you who have heard the term Amazons before, it's applied to the elite warrior class who were taken as children as female slaves, brought into the capital city of Dahomey and were used as basically a Praetorian guard or a royal bodyguard for the royal family. And the Amazons reach elevated status in the city-states of Dahomey. They become actual elites despite the fact that they're of slave origins, due to this increased role in the military elites. They're really the top dogs when it comes to the Dahomean military. And they're used as the royal bodyguard for the king of Dahomey. You have other people like griots in West Africa and the Senegambia region. They're used as musicians, entertainers, they're songwriters. Those songwriters are also tasked with keeping the history of a particular community. They keep the lineage of the kings of these regions and retrace all the historical narratives of the place through their songs. But slaves hold those types of positions as well. Some other slaves form artisan classes. They become blacksmiths, woodworkers. They become weapons makers. They will go into coastal areas and become the bulk of the fishing industry or the salt production industry. So they do hold a lot of positions that can fall under human slavery. But there's another type of slavery altogether that operates in pre-colonial and pre-contact Africa, and that is spiritual slavery. Now, this is a totally different type of slavery. You are not enslaved to another human being. No part of your labor belongs to another human being. You are actually being given over to a deity, a god or a goddess. And the way that this sort of manifests itself can be different across different areas of Africa. Sometimes the spiritual slave becomes the embodiment of the god. And if that's the case, the status of the slave within that community is going to be vastly elevated because people are worshiping and propitiating these gods. And you become the living representation of the god. It's going to elevate where you get in the community. Sometimes you're betrothed to a deity as a slave. If there's a goddess, male slaves might be brought to marry the goddess, meaning that they're going to be taken care of pretty well, these male slaves, for the rest of their lives because they're married to a very important deity within a community. On the flip side of that, if you're in love with an actual physical, tangible person in your community, you can't marry that person anymore because you are now betrothed or married to a deity and you can't take a human spouse. And so we see this kind of thing going on. Sometimes slaves are brought into communities and they're turned into the priests or priestesses or devotees of these particular deities. And so under spiritual slavery, there's a lot of circumstances under which your freedom of mobility and your ability to sort of make a lot of decisions for yourself, that becomes marginalized. You have a lot of those choices taken away from you. But at the same time, being a spiritual slave can drastically increase your social status within the community in which you're enslaved. And so that's another sort of aspect that we see playing out in sub-Saharan African slavery prior to the emergence of the Atlantic slave trade. And then finally, there's another system in play that Europeans, a lot of times, they mistake for slavery. They have a hard time distinguishing it from slavery, but that's called pawnship or debt pawnage. And that is basically, it's very, very, very close to what we call indentured servitude in the West. Basically, I owe someone money, and I can't pay up. So I owe them a debt, right? But I don't have the actual physical cash to pay them. I don't have the products to pay them back the equal value. Well, my labor is a product. And I'm going to basically say for the next 4 to 5 years, I'm going to work for you, and I will pay off this debt by working for you. Now, the interesting part about debt pawnage or pawnship that makes it look like slavery to Europeans is even if I'm the one who owes the debt, I'm not the one who necessarily has to pay it. If I have a dependent or a child, I can put my child into that position and they can work off my debt. I can put a nephew or a cousin. I can put a sibling if they're willing to step in and take that role on. Or I can pawn myself and use my own labor. So these are the 3 broad categories of human servitude that we're seeing playing out in Africa. And really, at the end of the day, what you can take away from this is there's a much greater level of social mobility in African slave systems. We even see some unique examples of slaves starting out as the lowest rung of society, being slaves within an enslaving community, rising to become the heads of states. We saw this in my own work. I wrote my dissertation on King Jaja of Apobo. He was born in Igbo land in the 1820s, and by the 1830s, because of some local politics where he's from, he found himself sold into slavery in the southern Niger Delta. There, he'll become the head of his household or Wari in the Ijaw language, and he will ultimately rise to become the head of that house and then go into a protracted civil war, at the end of which he establishes his own community and becomes a king. So we have a guy rising all the way from slave to king in the 19th century within Nigeria's slave systems. The same thing can be said of Opoku Frefre. He's going to ultimately become the king of the Asante people in what is now modern-day Ghana. And he does this by becoming the favored son of the Asante Hene, or Queen Mother. She adopts him into her family, making him part of the royal lineage, which means he can be placed on the throne of the Asante people, and that's ultimately what's happening with Opoku Frefre. You also have Eze Kalu, who is actually one of the slaves of that guy I was just talking about, King Jaja in southern Nigeria. Jaja himself, when he becomes king, takes a number of slaves. And that Kalu guy, he is going to ultimately work as a slave for Jaja, trading palm oil in the Niger Delta. And when Jaja is ultimately deposed and exiled by the British out of this area, Eze is able to go back to Igbo land, to his own community, and because of the money he made in the palm oil trade and the influence he has with the British down in the Niger Delta, he's ultimately going to become a head chief or a leader in his natal community, the area he was born and taken from as a child. So we're seeing that there's a lot more opportunity for political, social, and economic mobility within these African slave systems. Really, like I said, all of this literature, this is actually one of the most overlooked parts of African history. It's something that a lot of people are uncomfortable talking about because really the dominating narrative of this time period is the Atlantic slave trade is devastating Africa. And I want to make clear that the existence of slavery in Africa doesn't negate or undo any of the negative impacts of Atlantic slavery. In fact, all of these systems that provide some opportunities for people to rise out of their slave position, they start going away as the Atlantic more and more impacts what's happening in the coastal regions of Africa. The Atlantic slave trade absolutely, horribly, and irreparably devastates Africa. And I want to make clear that talking about indigenous slavery and recognizing what's existing there before doesn't diminish the negative impact or the role or culpability of Europeans within the establishment of that system. Simply what we're trying to do is we're trying to frame what is African slavery? What did it look like prior to the onset of the Atlantic slave trade? And how is it different from slavery in the Western world? And you can see with a lot of the theories that come out of social scientists and historians, it's all about comparing and showing how relatively benign African slavery really is. When you start to compare it to some of the institutions that exist globally at this time period. So, the major takeaways from this is that there is room for growth and mobility for slaves in West Africa. They ultimately get rolled into the kinship networks of Africa, and they're ultimately going to become major players within their communities. Eventually, they're going to shed the slavery status and just become full members of the society. And at the end of the day, what that's going to do is it's going to put former slaves in a lot of positions of power. And that's just not something we see in the Western world. And because slavery operates in this way in Africa, we see that there is really no need for uniform slave codes, for violence against your slaves or the threat of violence to try to keep people in line. That's something you don't see very often playing out in Africa. The only place you see some similarity to what we see in the Western world is in the Islamic world of Africa, on the East Coast in the Swahili states and in North Africa. And that again has to do with a similar sort of legal basis off of which slavery is operating there. But you do see the emergence of some plantation-style slavery in the Swahili states. Zanzibar, the island of Zanzibar becomes a massive clove plantation, but that's being organized by Arab traders from the Arabian Peninsula, and they're establishing a very different, what you could call a non-African style of slave regime out in the eastern parts of Africa. But for the most part, what we're seeing is slavery, both in decentralized and centralized states in Africa, are going to give opportunities to people. And that's not to say that slavery is good. It can be simultaneously empowering and disempowering. But what we need to recognize is that we need to remove this Western understanding of slavery from our mindsets to understand how things actually operated on the African continent before the emergence of the global slave trades, in particular the Atlantic slave trade. From, it intensifies around the 1700 and will remain a very devastating force in Africa until about 1860. That's the phase of Atlantic slave trading where we see the numbers skyrocketing every decade. So that's my spiel for this week. As usual, if you have any questions, concerns, or comments, feel free to email me. Take care.